On June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in history began. Operation Barbarossa opened with 3 million German soldiers and their allies pouring across the Soviet frontier. Hitler's plan was simple in theory, devastating in execution. Blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Poland and France were now unleashed across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The attack fell on an unprepared Red Army. Stalin had ignored warnings from intelligence and even his own generals. When the German column struck, they advanced with terrifying speed. Panzers cut deep into Soviet territory, leaving isolated units behind to be destroyed by following infantry. Luftwaffe squadrons swept the skies, hammering Soviet airfields before many planes could even take off. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Near Minsk, Smolensk, and later at Kiev, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped. Prisoner columns stretched for miles, with ragged men marching east under German guard. By the end of 1941, nearly 3 million Soviet troops had been captured. The German High Command believed the Soviet Union would collapse as quickly as France had. But despite the disaster, new Soviet formations kept appearing. Factories east of the Urals worked day and night to replace lost weapons. And unlike the short campaigns in the West, the distances in Russia were vast. Each new mile of advance stretched German supply lines thinner. By autumn, Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Moscow. Freezing weather and stiffening Soviet resistance brought the Blitzkrieg to a halt. For the first time, German troops faced the prospect of a winter war they were not prepared to fight. In December, the Red Army counterattacked, driving the invaders back from the capital. Hitler's ambitions did not waver. In the spring of 1942, he shifted his strategy. Instead of another push on Moscow, the new plan focused on the south. German armies would strike toward the Caucasus to seize vital oil fields. Another thrust would move along the Volga River, cutting Soviet transport routes. At the heart of the strategy lay one city, Stalingrad. Sitting on the western bank of the Volga, it was an industrial hub, a vital link in Soviet logistics, and it carried the name of Hitler's rival. Capturing it promised both practical advantage and symbolic triumph. Through the summer of 1942, German divisions rolled east across the steppe. Tanks kicked up dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Villages fell one after another. Luftwaffe bombers pounded rail junctions and depots. The Soviet defenders, still reeling from the disasters of the previous year, fell back again and again. By August, German troops reached the approaches to Stalingrad. Behind them lay a trail of conquest stretching nearly 1,000 miles from the western border. Ahead stood a sprawling city on the Volga, already under bombardment, its fate about to decide the future of the Eastern Front. On August 23, 1942, the battle for Stalingrad erupted in fire. The Luftwaffe struck with hundreds of bombers. Explosions rolled through the city, tearing open streets, collapsing buildings, and setting whole districts ablaze. A black cloud hung over the Volga as tens of thousands of civilians were killed in a single day. When the smoke cleared, the city was no longer whole. It was rubble. But that rubble became a fortress. German infantry moved in expecting quick victory. Instead, they found shattered blocks where every wall concealed danger. Soviet defenders turned basements into bunkers and attics into sniper nests. Every ruined factory became a stronghold. The Germans gave the fight a name, Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. The struggle was fought room by room. Streets became front lines. A single building might change hands several times in one day. Grenades and submachine guns echoed in stairwells. Knives and bayonets finished fights in cellars. Famous landmarks turned into battlefields. The central railway station was stormed repeatedly until it was nothing but a shell of scorched walls. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that overlooked the city, was captured, lost, and captured again. Its slopes were so saturated with metal that even decades later the ground would bleed rust. In the north, the tractor factory became a symbol of defiance. Workers assembled tanks under bombardment, driving them straight from the assembly line into combat. At the Barricade and Red October factories, machine shops and furnaces became nests for machine guns and mortars. For the Red Army, the order was absolute, hold at all costs. Across the Volga, reinforcements crossed under fire. Barges slipped through burning oil slicks and bombardment, bringing new troops and ammunition to the riverbank. Many never made it. But those who did staggered into the city to replace the fallen. German progress slowed to nothing. They had captured much of the city by October, but their lines frayed against the sheer will of the defenders. The Soviets held only narrow strips of rubble pressed to the Volga's edge, some positions no deeper than a football field, yet they did not collapse. In those ruins, snipers hunted. One bullet at a time, marksmen turned every crossing and street corner into a killing ground. Soviet commanders moved unseen through tunnels and sewers. Civilians who had not fled fought beside soldiers, determined to make every street a graveyard for the invader. By autumn's end, the city was nearly destroyed. Smoke, fire, and corpses defined the landscape. The German Sixth Army believed it was on the verge of total victory. But even as its soldiers fought block by block for the last strips of the riverbank, Soviet generals outside the city were preparing a counterblow. The trap was almost ready to close. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army was locked in savage fighting inside Stalingrad. It seemed only a matter of time before the Soviets were pushed into the river. But far from the ruins of the city, Red Army commanders were preparing a massive counterstroke. The plan was called Operation Uranus. Its aim was not to fight for streets, but to surround the entire German force. The Germans had concentrated their best troops in the city itself. On the flanks north and south of Stalingrad, their lines were held by weaker allies. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions stretched thin across the frozen steppe. These men had little armor and few anti-tank weapons. They faced the weight of the Soviet winter offensive. On the morning of November 19th, the Northern Strike began. More than 3,000 Soviet guns thundered in unison, shaking the steppe. Under cover of his barrage, entire armies surged forward. Tanks and cavalry smashed into Romanian positions near the Don River. Infantry swarmed through gaps as resistance crumbled. Within a day, the German northern flank was collapsing. 2 days later, the Southern Strike fell upon the Romanian Third Army. Once again, the front disintegrated. Soviet armored corps poured through the breach, racing toward Kalach on the Don, the key crossing point behind Stalingrad. The trap was closing. For German soldiers inside the city, the sounds of battle came from behind them, from the west. At first, they dismissed them as distant attacks. Soon it became clear that the Soviets were not simply reinforcing Stalingrad, they were surrounding it. Panic spread as reports arrived of Romanian allies fleeing, of Soviet tanks rampaging across the rear. By November 23rd, the northern and southern pincers met at Kalach. The encirclement was complete. More than 300,000 Axis troops were trapped in and around Stalingrad. Hitler ordered them to hold fast. There would be no breakout. The Sixth Army was to fight where it stood. The Soviets built outer and inner defensive rings, one to keep the Germans in, the other to keep relief forces out. Supply lines across the steppe were cut. The Luftwaffe promised to resupply the pocket by air, but even at maximum effort they could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger and cold began to gnaw at the trapped men. In just 4 days, the course of the entire battle had shifted. What seemed like a German victory was transformed into a disaster. The hunter had become the hunted. The Red Army had seized the initiative, and the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was trapped. The Soviet encirclement had snapped shut in late November. What had once been an army of more than 300,000 men was now cut off from the outside world, surrounded by 2 Soviet fronts and winter itself. Hunger began to gnaw at the trapped divisions. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded soldiers froze to death in cellars because there were no bandages left to treat them. The thermometer fell below -20 degrees Celsius. Men without winter clothing burned furniture for heat. Frostbite claimed thousands. By December, the Soviets tightened the noose. All attempts at relief failed. Operation Winter Storm, the German effort to break through from the south, collapsed before reaching the pocket. Paulus was urged by his officers to attempt a breakout. But Hitler's orders were clear: the Sixth Army was to stay and fight to the last man. Soviet forces pressed closer to the city center. Street by street, block by block, the perimeter shrank. By January, the Germans were confined to a fraction of their former lines. Their airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak were overrun, cutting off the last means of evacuation. Wounded who had been waiting for flights were left behind to face capture. Inside the pocket, morale collapsed. Soldiers scoured frozen corpses for boots and greatcoats. Entire units ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. Discipline broke down. Some men surrendered in groups, others simply lay down in the snow. The Soviets broadcast surrender offers by loudspeaker. Paulus forbade negotiations, but many of his men no longer listened. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet troops reached Paulus's headquarters in the basement of a department store. The German field marshal, newly promoted by Hitler only the day before, surrendered with what remained of his staff. In the northern part of the city, a few pockets continued to resist for 2 more days. Then, they too laid down their arms. 91,000 starving and frostbitten survivors were marched into captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died of hunger, disease, and exhaustion in Soviet camps. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked more than the loss of 300,000 men. It was the first time a German field army had been completely destroyed. The defeat shattered the image of Nazi invincibility. Across the world, headlines proclaimed that Hitler's fortunes had turned. For the Soviet Union, the victory was a symbol of survival and strength. The Red Army had endured the worst that the Wehrmacht could throw at it and emerged stronger. Morale soared as the defenders of Stalingrad were hailed as heroes of the motherland. On the German side, the shock was profound. Families waited for loved ones who would never return. Of the 91,000 survivors who marched into Soviet captivity, only a fraction would live to see Germany again. Within Hitler's circle, doubts grew, though open opposition remained unthinkable. Strategically, the loss at the Sixth Army opened the southern front. The Soviets pressed westward, retaking Rostov and pushing toward the Dnieper. In July 1943, the two armies clashed again at Kursk in the largest tank battle in history. This time, the Germans failed to regain the initiative. From Stalingrad onward, the war in the east was a relentless Soviet advance. The Red Army drove across Ukraine, into Poland, and finally toward Berlin. Each step westward traced its origin back to the frozen ruins on the Volga. The Battle of Stalingrad cost more than 2 million casualties combined, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire districts of the city were flattened. Yet from that devastation came the turning of the tide. When Soviet troops raised their banner over the ruins in February 1943, they carried with them not only victory in a single battle, but the momentum that would end the war 2 years later in the heart of Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a victory, it was the turning point of the Second World War. If you enjoyed this film and would like to see more history brought to life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for future episodes.